In February 2012, the world reacted to the death of Whitney Houston with shock. News headlines described it as sudden. Social media called it unexpected. But when you look closely at the facts, one thing becomes clear. Whitney Houston's death was not sudden. It was the final point of a long, visible decline that had begun years earlier. By 2007, Whitney Houston, one of the most commercially successful vocalists in music history, had almost completely disappeared from active public life. This is not speculation. It is documented fact. According to Billboard archives and official records from Arista Records, between 2004 and 2008, Whitney released no new studio albums, performed no major world tours, and gave almost no high-profile interviews. For an artist of her stature, this was not a creative pause. It was a warning sign. Her last major tour before that silence ended in 2004. After that, the momentum stopped. So the question is not what happened in 2012. The real question is, what happened in the years when no one was watching? To understand this, we have to go back much further to the system that shaped Whitney Houston from the very beginning. From the start of her career, Whitney was carefully constructed as an image. She was marketed as pure, controlled, powerful, and flawless. This was not accidental. Clive Davis, the executive who played a central role in her rise, openly admitted that Whitney was not just selling music. She was selling a symbol. The symbol of perfection. The symbol of strength. The symbol of an ideal American voice. The problem with being a symbol is simple. Symbols are not allowed to break. By the early 2000s, Whitney Houston was already struggling with substance abuse. This is not rumor. It was acknowledged publicly in her 2002 interview with Diane Sawyer, confirmed by family members, and later admitted by Whitney herself. In that interview, she famously dismissed the issue by saying, "Crack is whack." The phrase became iconic, but it also became a shield, because what followed was not recovery, it was denial. The industry continued to push forward, albums, appearances, expectations, and behind the scenes, the gap between the public image and the private reality grew wider. By 2007, the pressure reached a breaking point. That year, Whitney finalized her divorce from Bobby Brown. To the public, it looked like freedom, the end of a toxic relationship, a chance to start over. But according to people closest to her, the opposite happened. After the divorce, Whitney did not become stronger. She became more isolated. This was confirmed by multiple witnesses interviewed in the documentary Whitney released in 2018. Friends, security personnel, and former staff members all described the same pattern. Whitney withdrew. She limited contact. She spent long periods alone. She stopped showing up. Studio sessions were cancelled or abandoned. Meetings were postponed. Phone calls went unanswered. This matters because it marks the moment when Whitney's career did not just slow down, it stalled. And here is the critical question that changes how we see everything that followed. Was Whitney stepping away to heal? Or was she being left alone because the system no longer knew how to fix her? Because by this point, the industry had a problem. Whitney Houston was still a global icon. Her name still carried enormous financial weight. But the person behind the name was exhausted, vulnerable, and increasingly disconnected from the world that depended on her success. And the system around her was running out of patience. This is where the story truly begins. In the next chapter, we will examine what life actually looked like for Whitney Houston in 2007 and 2008. The years of isolation, failed attempts at recovery, and early warning signs that were quietly ignored. Because by the time the comeback was announced, the damage had already been done. By 2007, Whitney Houston's isolation was no longer subtle, it was measurable. According to people who worked closely with her during that period, Whitney drastically reduced her daily interactions. She no longer maintained a regular work schedule. Studio bookings were made and then cancelled. Meetings were confirmed and then quietly abandoned. This was not chaos, it was withdrawal. Security personnel later interviewed for the documentary Whitney described long stretches when Whitney barely left her home. Days would pass without visitors. Phone calls often went unanswered. Even family members sometimes did not know her exact condition. At the same time, reports emerged that Whitney entered short-term rehabilitation programs multiple times between 2007 and 2008. These were not long, structured recoveries. They were brief interventions, attempts to stabilize rather than fully treat. This distinction matters. Medical experts have consistently stated that long-term substance dependency combined with psychological trauma requires sustained, carefully monitored treatment. What Whitney received instead were temporary resets, moments of pause before returning to the same environment. And that environment had not changed. Financial pressure was quietly building. Whitney Houston was still under contract. Her name still generated value, but her career was frozen. According to industry insiders, Arista Records began discussing a possible comeback, not because Whitney was fully ready, but because time was running out. Contracts had deadlines, advances had to be justified, silence was no longer an option. Around this time, Whitney began watching recordings of her early performances obsessively. This detail appears repeatedly in interviews with people close to her. She watched concerts from the late 1980s. She watched herself sing effortlessly, powerfully without strain, and she would often say very little afterward. One friend later recalled that Whitney once asked quietly, "Where did she go?" She was not speaking metaphorically. She was speaking about herself. This period marks a critical psychological shift. Whitney no longer identified with her present self. Her reference point became the past, a version of herself that felt unreachable. And yet, the world expected her to return as if nothing had changed. In 2008, discussions about a full comeback became more serious. Meetings resumed, producers were contacted, plans were drafted. But behind the optimism was a growing concern about her physical condition. Several producers later admitted that Whitney's stamina was inconsistent. Some days she sounded strong. Other days she struggled to complete basic vocal takes. The unpredictability made long-term planning difficult, but not impossible. And that was the problem. Instead of stopping and reassessing, the industry chose to move forward cautiously but persistently. Whitney herself expressed mixed emotions about returning. On one hand, she believed music might save her. On the other, she feared that stepping back onto the stage would expose how much she had changed. This fear was documented in multiple interviews after her death. She was not afraid of performing. She was afraid of comparison, because every note she sang would be measured against the memory of who she once was. By late 2008, Whitney appeared physically healthier. She had lost weight. She smiled more during public appearances. The media began using the word comeback. But appearance is not recovery. What few people understood at the time was that Whitney was moving forward without rebuilding the foundation underneath her. She had not regained emotional stability. She had not resolved her dependency. She had not redefined her identity outside of perfection. And yet, momentum was building. The comeback was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. And once that momentum started, it became very difficult to stop. In the next chapter, we will examine the making of I Look to You, the album that was presented as Whitney Houston's return, but was in reality the beginning of a much more dangerous chapter. Because the studio revealed a truth the stage would later expose. By early 2009, the comeback was no longer theoretical. It had a title, it had a release window, and it had expectations. The album was called I Look to You. Publicly, it was framed as a story of renewal, faith, strength, survival. Privately, it was something very different. According to multiple producers involved in the project, the decision to move forward was driven as much by obligation as by optimism. Whitney Houston was still one of the most recognizable names in music history. Arista Records needed a return, the industry needed a narrative, and Whitney needed purpose. Studio sessions began with cautious hope. Producers described moments when Whitney sounded unmistakably like herself, controlled, emotional, precise. Those moments became the backbone of the album, but they were not consistent. Several sessions were shortened or stopped entirely. Whitney would arrive tired. Sometimes she needed long breaks between takes. Sometimes she would sing only a few lines before her voice weakened. This was not a question of talent. It was a question of endurance. Vocal coaches later explained that long-term substance use, combined with years of intense touring and smoking, had reduced Whitney's vocal stamina. Her range still existed, but the muscle memory and breath support required to sustain it were compromised. And this created a dangerous illusion, because in the controlled environment of a studio, weakness can be hidden. Producers can select the strongest takes, engineers can polish the sound, breaks can be extended, sessions can be spread out over weeks. The album I Look to You benefited from all of this. When it was released in August 2009, it debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. Critics called it a triumphant return. Headlines celebrated Whitney Houston's comeback. But behind the celebration, there was concern. Several people involved in the album later admitted that they were unsure whether Whitney could support the material live. The studio had protected her. The stage would not. And yet, plans for a world tour moved forward almost immediately. This is where pressure replaced caution. According to industry reports, the album's success created an urgency to capitalize on momentum. Touring was financially essential. Promotion required visibility. Silence was no longer acceptable. Whitney herself reportedly expressed hesitation. She worried about her voice. She worried about the physical demands. She worried about disappointing fans. But the narrative had already been set. She was back. And once that word was printed, retreat became nearly impossible. Friends later said that Whitney viewed the album as a personal victory, but the tour as a test she feared failing. She knew the difference between sounding good in a studio and surviving night after night on stage. The question no one asked publicly was the most important one. Was Whitney Houston being given time to rebuild, or was she being asked to perform before she was ready? Because recovery is not linear, and pressure does not heal. As rehearsals for live performances began, early warning signs appeared. Whitney's voice fluctuated. Some days were strong, others were fragile. Rest days were suggested, but rarely enforced. The system moved forward, and this is the moment where the story turns from comeback to crisis. Because the stage would soon expose what the studio had concealed. In the next chapter, we will examine what happened to Whitney Houston's voice, not emotionally, but physically. What years of strain, stress, and neglect had done to an instrument that once seemed indestructible, and why by the time the tour began, the damage was already too deep. To understand what happened next, we have to separate emotion from physiology. Whitney Houston's voice did not disappear overnight. It deteriorated, slowly, predictably, and visibly. Vocal specialists who later analyzed her performances explained that Whitney's instrument had suffered from 3 converging factors: prolonged substance use, chronic smoking, and years of intense touring without adequate vocal rest. Each of these factors alone is damaging. Together, they are destructive. Substance use can inflame and weaken the vocal folds. Smoking dries and thickens the vocal cords. Chronic stress reduces breath control and muscular coordination. By the late 2000s, all 3 were present. This explains a critical contradiction that confused audiences. Whitney could still hit powerful notes, but she could not sustain them. Her range had not vanished. Her endurance had. In technical terms, this meant unstable breath support, delayed vocal onset, and rapid fatigue. These symptoms were audible in live performances recorded during rehearsals and early appearances in 2009. Several vocal coaches later stated that Whitney's condition required extended vocal rest, months, not weeks. She needed silence, rehabilitation, and a complete restructuring of her technique. That did not happen. Instead, rehearsals continued. Witnesses described days when Whitney sounded strong, followed by days when she struggled to complete basic warm-ups. On difficult days, sessions were shortened. On better days, the system pushed forward, hoping momentum would carry her through. Hope replaced medical caution. This is where a crucial decision was made, not publicly, but practically. The tour would go on. From a business perspective, the logic was clear. The album had debuted at #1. Demand was high, delays risked losing relevance. From a medical perspective, the risk was obvious. Live touring is unforgiving. Unlike a studio, there are no second takes, no extended breaks, no editing. Every night demands the same output. Whitney knew this. Multiple people later recalled her expressing anxiety before performances. She worried about her voice failing mid-song. She worried about disappointing audiences who remembered her at her peak. What made this pressure unbearable was comparison. Whitney was not competing with other artists. She was competing with her own past. Every audience came with expectations shaped by decades of flawless performances. Any deviation was interpreted not as human limitation, but as failure. And this fear fed into a destructive cycle. Anxiety tightened her throat. Tension weakened breath support. Fatigue increased vocal instability. By the time the tour officially began in late 2009, the warning signs were no longer subtle. Critics noted strained vocals. Fans noticed inconsistency. Some concerts were cut short, and yet the schedule remained largely intact. This raises a difficult but necessary question. Why didn't anyone stop the tour? The answer lies in a combination of factors: financial obligations, contractual pressure, and the absence of a single authority willing to say no. Everyone involved had a stake. Few had the power or the courage to intervene. What should have been a recovery period became an endurance test. And Whitney was losing. In the next chapter, we will follow the tour itself, night by night, city by city, and examine how the physical decline turned into public humiliation, emotional collapse, and irreversible damage. Because once the tour started, there was no turning back. The 2009-2010 World Tour was supposed to confirm Whitney Houston's return. Instead, it exposed the cost of moving forward when stopping was the safer option. From the very first shows, the pattern was clear. Some nights, Whitney sounded close to her former self. On other nights, her voice faltered early, strained under pressure, and faded before the set ended. Audience reactions were mixed. Longtime fans wanted to believe. Critics were less forgiving. Reviews from multiple cities described inconsistency, vocal fatigue, and visible distress. In some venues, fans walked out early. In others, applause felt supportive but cautious, as if the audience sensed they were witnessing a struggle rather than a performance. Behind the scenes, the situation was worse. Members of the touring team later described a constant state of tension. Every show became a question mark. Would Whitney make it through the night? Would the set need to be shortened? Would the next date be cancelled? Several concerts were in fact cancelled or cut short. Official statements cited illness or exhaustion. The reality was that Whitney's body could not recover fast enough between performances. This is a critical point. Touring does not allow for gradual healing. It demands repetition. night after night, city after city. Whitney's condition required rest. The tour required endurance. The two were incompatible. Pressure intensified as negative press accumulated. Headlines focused on vocal decline rather than resilience. Comparisons to her early career were relentless. Every clip circulated online reinforced the same narrative. She was no longer the Whitney people remembered. This public scrutiny had a direct psychological impact. People close to her later said that Whitney internalized the criticism deeply. She read reviews, she watched footage, she blamed herself. She felt she was letting everyone down, fans, her team, her legacy. In private moments, she reportedly expressed regret about agreeing to the tour. She questioned whether she had returned too soon. But by then, the machinery was already in motion. Contracts were signed, venues were booked, money was spent. Stopping would have meant admitting failure, not just professionally, but symbolically. And that was something Whitney Houston had been trained her entire life not to do. As the tour continued, her emotional state deteriorated alongside her physical condition. Fatigue compounded anxiety. Anxiety affected performance. Performance fueled more criticism. It was a feedback loop with no exit. By mid-2010, the tour ended not with triumph, but with relief. There was no grand finale, no sense of closure, just exhaustion. What followed was not recovery. Instead, Whitney entered a period of deep emotional withdrawal. The tour had confirmed her greatest fear. The world no longer saw her as she once was. This realization would shape the final chapter of her life. Because when the stage is gone and the applause fades, the question becomes painfully simple. Who are you without the performance? In the next and final chapter, we will examine what happened after the tour ended, the financial consequences, the isolation, and the final months that led to her death. Because the most misunderstood part of Whitney Houston's story is not how she died, but how she lived when the music stopped. When the tour ended in 2010, there was no recovery period waiting for Whitney Houston. There was silence. Publicly, she stepped back. Privately, the consequences of the previous years began to surface all at once. Despite decades of success, Whitney's financial situation was fragile. According to multiple industry reports and later confirmations by people close to her, she was carrying significant obligations, advances that needed to be recouped, ongoing expenses, and the financial responsibility of supporting a large circle of family and dependents. This is a common but rarely discussed reality of major stars. High income does not always mean financial security, especially when touring, the primary revenue engine, becomes impossible to sustain. By 2011, Whitney was no longer touring. New recording plans were uncertain, and without consistent performance income, pressure quietly returned. But this time, it was not external, it was internal. Friends later described Whitney during this period as emotionally exhausted and increasingly isolated. She still appeared in public occasionally, award events, industry gatherings, but those appearances masked a deeper withdrawal. She spoke less about the future, she talked more about the past. Several people recalled her revisiting memories of her early career, her mother's guidance, and the time before fame became expectation. These were not nostalgic conversations, they carried a sense of loss. In the final year of her life, Whitney made intermittent attempts to re-engage with music. She discussed new material, she spoke about taking things slowly. But no concrete long-term plan ever stabilized. The system that once surrounded her with constant direction was no longer actively guiding her, yet it also never truly let go. And this left Whitney in a dangerous middle ground, no longer protected by structure, but still burdened by legacy. On February 11, 2012, Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in her hotel room at the Beverly Hilton in Los Angeles. She was in the city for Grammy weekend, a reminder that even in her final days, the industry remained close. The official cause of death was accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. The announcement shocked the public, but for those who had watched her struggle over the previous 5 years, it felt tragically consistent. This was not a sudden collapse. It was the final outcome of prolonged strain, physical, psychological, and systemic. Whitney Houston did not fail because she lacked talent. She did not fail because she stopped trying. She failed because the environment around her did not slow down when she needed it to, and because she was never allowed to exist without being extraordinary. In the aftermath of her death, the conversation focused on blame, on substances, on relationships, on mistakes. But the larger truth is more uncomfortable. Whitney Houston's story is not just about addiction. It is about a system that rewards perfection and punishes vulnerability. A system that celebrates return, but rarely supports recovery. And perhaps the most painful question remains unanswered. If Whitney Houston had been allowed to stop, truly stop, would she still be here?